Welcome to the 43rd episode of the interview series. The interview series is a production of 1 Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1, weekcritique.com. Please like and subscribe to help us continue producing excellent content. I'm Jon Riccio, joined today by Alina Ștefănescu. Alina Ștefănescu was born in Romania and lives in Birmingham, Alabama, with her partner and several intense mammals. Recent books include a creative nonfiction chapbook, Ribbled, Bull City Press Inch series that came out in November 2020, and Door, which won the Wandering Aengus Press Prize in September 2021. Her debut fiction collection, Every Mask I Tried On, won the Bright Horse Books Prize, April 2018. Alina's poems, essays, and fiction can be found in Prairie Schooner, North American Review, World Literature Today, Pleiades, Poetry, Bomb, Crab Creek Review, and others. She serves as poetry editor for several journals, reviewer and critic for others, and co-director of PEN America's Birmingham chapter. She is currently working on a novel-like creature. You can read more of Alina's work online at www.alinastefanescuwriter.com. It's great to be discussing poetry with you, Alina. We've been in a Zoom writers group since the summer of 2020, though hopefully one of these days we'll get the chance to meet in person. Hattiesburg, Birmingham, I think it's maybe 6 hours of distance. We'll figure it out one of these months, right?
Yeah, we need to do that. It was that writing group was sort of my respite during pandemic, and I'm so grateful for the writers that I met there, and I learned so much. And every writer is so different, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It was such an eye on the stuff that I was doing. That was really, really helpful. As you know, it was exciting to get to talk to you about your background in music and how that influenced your formal work or your attention to rhyme and meter, and also to the fascinating sort of visions you have about how poetry can change. So.
Well, thank you. And I know music has a special part in your poetics process. I think we've even had entire Zoom conversations about Enescu's Third Violin Sonata. I still listen to that when I have to grade my papers. I just get the old Enescu queued up, and there we go. And Romanian Rhapsody 1. That's number 2 is, I mean, I like number 2, but I'm more of a number 1 fan with that Enescu Romanian Rhapsody, but there are 2 out there if you want to add more Enescu to your listening language vocabulary catalog, as it were.
Yeah.
And all this is to say that because of that poetry group, I had the opportunity to spend more time with your work, and that brings us to Door. I hold in my hands a well-perused copy of it, in all its back cover, nesting doll, atop an asterisk horse, cloud galloping glory. Amelia Martins writes, "The book will singe your fingertips, show the life you are sewn into, feed you missing language, and cut through the deep fake of not feeling." Aaron Coughlin Hollowell claims, "This is a collection that twists form and content into poems that are by turns tender or incendiary, or both." Congratulations on your Wandering Aengus Book Prize win.
Thank you. I feel so lucky. So because we brought up the book and you showed the back cover, I have to say that I'm really lucky too that a Romanian artist, Ioana Hobai, who I got in touch with on Twitter of all places, we sort of, I don't know, and it got in touch. And when I was thinking about the cover, I really wanted to have a Romanian artist do the cover because the word is so sort of loaded for Romanians. And she drew this wonderful little thing. I'm going to do a close up. The picture of the little Matryoshka doll on the horse, which when we went back to Romania to take some of my mother's ashes to Romania, we carried the ashes in a little Matryoshka doll with tape around it. And we carried them through the airports, you know, through the whole country until we got to this one place. And there was also this horse that shows up, this pony that shows up in the book, whose name was Cesar, who bit me and left me with a bruise that lasted throughout our journey, but who also is kind of like a little caesura, I guess. He plays a sort of, I don't know, the role of a formal caesura in it. He's the unexpected creature that also showed up. So, yeah.
It's interesting with the Matryoshka doll because I always associate that with back in the day, the Portage Public Library in my parents' hometown of Kalamazoo, Michigan, but then Portage, where we moved. There's the CD racks, and I would always go to the classical. And by the time they started combining past CDs into greatest hits, there was the requisite Shostakovich Concerti CD, and it had the Matryoshka, and it had the cello concerto, first cello concerto, it had the first violin concerto, it had a piano concerto. And I mostly remember that because Victoria Molova is the recording artist for the violin concerto. And I just associate that with Shostakovich now every time I see a little Matryoshka doll. But I'm sure there are other associations, maybe folkloric or.
It was an accident. It was just what small container can we carry mom in? And I couldn't do plastic. It had to be wood. I had like this superstitious view of plastic because my mom hated plastic. And then there was just this, I just took one of the kids' dolls and took out one of the Matryoshkas and was like, we'll take her in this. And we laughed about it. Like we would take her to bars. It was the sort of thing my mom would have loved. So the spirit of it too was also just, you know, it allowed her to sort of be a character with us, to be present, you know, to be referenced. Where is mom? You know, which is this haunting, horrible question to go back to Romania without her and say, where is mom? But also to hear her laughter, which was just her way of being in the world. She loved life and she was intense about expressing that. So.
And I think it's ironic that now we both live in that part of the United States where with the king cake, people bake little plastic babies into these gargantuan New Orleanian flavor fests. So we go from the nesting dolls to the little piece of plastic that could, right? Someone once brought my first Oscar party that I ever hosted in 2017. Someone brought a king cake. And I had no idea what it was, but sure enough, I mean, it was all about let's find that baby in the cake.
Yeah, that's true. That's an interesting comparison.
Well, as is our practice with the interview series, we're looking at an early version and the revision of a piece. We turn to your poem, Playing Possum, and its pre-collection debut, which was in the fall 2019 issue of Prairie Schooner. So Alina, if you could please read both back to back. And what I will do is I will share these on screen with our viewers, and then we'll toggle from the Prairie Schooner version to the Door version. Take it away.
Okay. Playing Possum, after Bayard Rustin. This is my mother newly dead, Mom says. She died without suffering. I fondle the photo of my maternal grandmother playing possum. A dead possum in a ditch is called roadkill. A possum who's just playing is not a carcass. The woman in my family will play anything to make you wonder. I am one of those women who finds herself playing just to see what you'd say about me then. The woman in the photo is my namesake. The photo is black and white, taken and developed by my grandfather. He was a gangly husband, a polymath, her fellow physician. They married in med school. Stars of the show, those two. It was my tall, reticent grandfather who administered the final morphine injection when the cancer took over her brain, when she was no longer the person she might recognize. He did this in secret without consulting the family. He did this in the living room of the remote Transylvanian chalet he designed and built by hand. Her green and white wooden dream house, a retreat for their retirement. He did it because she wanted to remain herself. She made him promise. She made him promise again. She said, "If you love me." He signed her request with a blue fountain pen from Czechoslovakia. The request lay among papers and photos he preserved, images of her naked breasts, a voile nightgown, smiling sepia, Alina, winsome, hungry, amorous, and finally, faceless. Two slender hands crossed in languor over her lower chest. An Orthodox cross poised above the V-shaped limbs, a flock of birds on their way to warmer shores. Above their wings, a cardboard icon. "I am an atheist now," he announced. But no one believed a man who hated God so much could ever come to disbelieve himself. This was Ceausescu's communist Romania. I know hate is a kind of hope. These lines in my hand, a Balkan mutation.
Thank you. Now we will go to the door version. Page 13, if you're following along in your book.
Oh, thank you. I'm looking for it. That's my lucky number. Playing possum. "This is my mother, newly dead," Mom said. "She died without suffering." I fondle the photo of my maternal grandmother playing possum. A dead possum in a ditch is called roadkill. A possum who's just playing is not yet carcass. The women in my family will play anything to make you wonder, just to see what you'd say about us then. The woman in the photo is my namesake, the photo taken by the man she met and married in med school. It was he who administered the final morphine injection when breast cancer claimed her brain. He did this without telling their daughters. He consulted none, invited none into the living room of the Transylvanian cottage he drafted and built by hand. It was her green dream house. He did it because she wanted to remain herself. She made him promise. She made him promise again. She said, "If you love me." He signed her request with a blue fountain pen from Czechoslovakia. The contract hid among papers, letters, photos he preserved, images of her naked breasts, arms raised above her head. His Alina, winsome, hungry, amorous, and finally, faceless. Two gray hands locked in languor over her chest. An Orthodox cross laid over V-shaped limbs, a flock of birds on their way to the Danube. I am an atheist now, he announced. But no one believed. None believed a man who hated God so faithfully could ever come to disbelieve himself. This was Ceausescu's Romania. The dictator ruled from posters with iron fists. I know hate and hope are kindred, knit through our palms. And these lines in my hand, a silenced mutation.
Excellent, Alina. Playing Possum is originally a prose poem that becomes lineated in Door. What led to this change?
That's a fantastic and unanswerable question. And I am still not certain that I prefer one version of the other over the other. So it's interesting reading both of them because I can see why both of them exist the way they exist. Um, I think that there was a sort of rhythm that I wanted, or a little bit of motion that I wanted in the lineation. Um, and I'm still not sure if that's something that actually comes through or happens, but that was the aspiration. And I toggled so many times between these two versions that I just ultimately sort of gave up and said, let's go with the different one, which is usually what I do. And it's a terrible thing to do. They tell you with standardized tests, you should go with your first impulse. Well, I'm the one that always is like, oh, I'm going to go with this. It could be this one because, and I think that's what I did here too. So that's not a great answer, but it's the truth.
No, I love that answer because it made me think of when I'm in my revision modes, my inclination is to always take a lineated poem and move it into prose. So that's where I can do most of the, let's get rid of this, let's get rid of this. This sticks out like a sore thumb. So my most, I think, critical self is in prose. And lineation is fun.
Interesting. That's interesting. So this was sort of typed from my notebook, the prose version, where it was, written as prose. And that's where, I mean, in some ways I still read it that way. Even in some ways the lineation is awkward to me. Yeah.
Prior to your poem, whose Prairie Schooner version is after Bayard Rustin, I knew little about his work as a Black civil rights leader, instrumental in the Freedom Rides and the 1963 March on Washington. Rustin's gayness, however, meant that he was relegated to more of a background than prominent figure, though he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom 26 years after his death. How did Rustin's influence shape playing Possum? And did the revisions lead to taking after Bayard Rustin out of the Door version?
It's a really good question, and it's something that haunts me. I should start by saying that Bayard Rustin is one of the thinkers who shaped me a tremendous amount probably in my 30s and still does. Most importantly, because living in the South, you grow up hearing about Martin Luther King Jr. You hear about the more acceptable, the married, the Christian, the sort of more mainstream, and you don't hear about the queer community. You don't hear about the those who were fighting for civil rights that were gay. And Bayard Rustin's writings and his thinking, which evolved over time, and I can't say I agree with everything he ever thought, but what I agree with and admire in him is his idealism. He has this incredible idealism that drives him. He lives very much on principle. He goes to prison for it. He works on a chain gang. He writes about the chain gang. He everything for him is part of life. And he reminds me of Emma Goldman in that way, right? Living this life that you believe. But he also questions ideologies often. And he ends up in this space that's sort of amorphous, but also asks how rights matter, the relationship between the state and the granting of human rights. Who administers human rights, right? What does a human right mean for an immigrant who doesn't have the same rights that a citizen has, right? Those are questions that animate the present. So when I was writing, and the reason why I wrote this poem about this secret in my family was I was going back through one of my notebooks one day, and I found some quotes and some of my personal dialogues with Bayard Rustin. And I was like, I need to write that thing. I need to tell that story.
Mhm.
I need to stop being afraid of whether it's seen as a crime or a love story or a tragedy, or I need to like stop allowing the world to tell me how to interpret it, and I just need to write it because it's complicated. And so he was originally there to acknowledge that, and then I took him out of the manuscript because I wasn't sure that I made clear why he was there. So he was kind of there as a ghost, but not elucidated or expanded upon. And I felt guilty in a way for not explaining more why he was there. But I guess he was sort of the animating force, I guess, so to speak. I don't know if that answers the question. I took some notes because I think I've been wanting to speak about Bayard Rustin for a long time, because he was so formative for me. And he was so formative, I think, for this country. He saw a long time ago that healthcare, for example, was going to be an issue. So I'm going to quote him, like in 1970s when the women's livers were out there protesting, and they asked for three things. They asked for free abortions, 24-hour daycare centers for children of working mothers, and equal educational and employment opportunities. And Bayard Rustin wrote, he said, well, okay, why are you just asking for that? Like, that is not enough. People criticize this platform for being over the top, too idealistic. And he was like, no, it's not enough, right? He said, basically, why abortion should be free, of course, but why isn't all healthcare free, right? Who is being left out of this conversation, right? So he's gesturing towards Black feminism, or to the limits of white feminism, but also in general to labor, which was always so important to him. And I think of how so many of the things he said were prophetic. Speaking of, the ellipses, so many of the things he said were prophetic. So many of his observations were true and are true in the US. The issues that we didn't address, the role of masculinity in every liberation movement, right? Whether it's a racial liberation movement or a neo-colonial, a liberation from colonials, like whether you're talking about, the communist movement in Romania, so many of these liberation movements were hijacked by the failure to address ideas of gender and masculinity, and how power would be defined. And Bayard Rustin was seen as weak because he was a pacifist, right? He was queer. But he was not in line with the definition of strength that operated and that was seen as successful. And I think that haunts us too, right? I mean, that is, we have Donald Trump, right? And we have, white supremacy, who has a very clear articulation of what strength means. It's violent, it has guns, it's manly man, it doesn't care, it's not worried, right? But it's very scared, right? So I think, I don't know, my dialogue, and I know this is discursive, it's my curse to be discursive, but my dialogue with Bayard Rustin's work also happens at the level of like his early membership in the Communist Party, and how strongly he felt about labor rights, and how they were tied to freedom for him, and then his moving away from it because he said, this is pretty much just like every other male-run operation I've been in, where it's basically turned into a bunch of guys arguing and throwing power around. And he also was prescient in saying that the fact that Americans don't know what socialism is, they confuse it with communism, right? They call me a communist, as he said, is a huge problem for this country. So you can see also the problems of the Cold War left in our intellectual heritage. And I'm a product in some ways of those problematic binaries and discussions about the Cold War too. That's a long one.
Thank you. This was awesome. I feel so lucky that we're having this real-time conversation about Bayard Rustin. And
I mean, Ella Baker said it too. You know, Ella Baker said there's a problem in this movement because women aren't allowed to speak. When she was talking about the civil rights movement in the 1950s, these come back in almost every sort of, you know, liberation movement. I mean, it's a gender has always been an issue.
it has. One of the many qualities that I love about Dora, and I keep coming back to the fact that there is this lens that I call the grandparent aspects, probably because the ones on my mother's side were Eastern European. We have your grandfather's microscope crafted to observe the tiniest verbs we imagine in the poem An American Litany. And one of my favorite poems in the collection, I Say Thread, whose only grandmother I ever met wore the same emerald silk dress to all holiday meals, its green and black spirals swirling round her eminently foreign body. The earlier playing Possum makes it clear that the male figure is your grandfather, while the book removes the grandfather title and refers to him as the man. Why did you make this decision?
It's a really excellent question, and it goes back to these questions of loyalty and masculinity as they were playing out in that relationship between two peers, two intellectual peers who were very much in love. So I should preface too, the photo that's being described is a classic death photo. My grandmother's hands crossed, not her face, right? And just showing that she was dead, the dead photo, right? But before that, along with this photo, are all these photos that he took of her and developed himself, where she's like in these nightgowns, holding a book in bed, topless, reading and laughing. So there's this incredibly unusual for that time erotic relationship between these two people who my mom and her sister always were like, you know, they were very much in love. It was a very intense relationship. My grandfather, there were a lot of questions about whether what he had done was a power move, right? And I think that I read the issue of the power that he had in the family to make that choice without talking to anyone else. To what extent was it based on him being not just her lover and her husband, but a man, the husband? How often do we see? So I think that came in, and the way that power tingles with love came in. And so I wanted to move from this space in which my grandfather was this recognizable person to me, which he was when he had his microscope and he was doing his, you know, he discovered so Romania didn't have outside medicine. They had their own. It was very closed economy. So he's the one who discovered the polio vaccine there. And it wasn't as good. It had more side effects than the ones here, but he was a lab scientist. He was very much someone who loved classical music. He played the violin. He was a cat human, very closed, introverted person, who was an atheist in many ways, or agnostic until she died. And she was, you know, she believed in God. She was Orthodox. So there's all these different relationships between them, but I wanted him to be a man there. And sort of to put that element in rather than to hold him in this sentimental light as grandfather, which I don't know the man who did that. I don't know what was going through his heart in that moment when he knew that my mom was pregnant with me and she just wanted her mom to meet this baby. And I don't know, I don't know. But I left out some lines. So there were the birds. One of the things she saw and how he knew it went to her brain is she started seeing birds flying in front of her eyes all the time. And she told him, I can't catch them and I can't stop them. Gheorghe, it's gone to my head. It's in my brain. And she was a physician. She knew there was no medical treatment, was just, a business, nothing to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was like, I know it's over.
Mm-hmm.
So
when you were speaking, and thank you, when you were in the earlier part of your response, this phrase came to me, erotic brainiacs, because, and of course I'm drawn to the 3+3 erotic brainiacs. So I think that should go in a poem somewhere. So may you have a wonderful day with that 3+3 syllable phrase. I give it to you.
I love how you hear that in talk. I love, it's just I value so much your ear, your musical ear for poetry is really just stunning.
Oh,
I love it.
thanks.
So thank you for
Well,
that.
and yeah, you have the ick in erotic and the ack in brainiac. So you have these percussive sounds, but you also have eroticism and intelligence. And speaking of phrases, warmer shores, we're back to playing Possum, is reworded as the Danube. And the mutation that is these lines in my hand, formerly described as Balkan, is now referred to as silenced. Were these geographical switches made for the sake of nuance?
I wish that they were made for the sake of nuance. They were made out of both fear, self-loathing, concern, and initially, when I was thinking about my grandfather and my grandmother's hands and that photo and the idea of playing dead or what it meant, because the photo very much, there's this sort of how do you know they're really dead? There's a question what if he just took that photo and she wasn't? This was the evidence. So in a way, those photos serve as evidence. I was thinking about the space that is Romania, which has changed over time. The borders have changed. They will probably keep changing. Who knows? That's very much a facet of life for people who are from the Balkans, from the Balkan part of the world. I removed warmer shores and put in the Danube because I wanted to gesture to this river and to this sort of geographic specificity, like you mentioned. And also because I wanted to remove Balkan because of the weight behind it. So what happened was I had read something recent by an American academic who was not connected to the Balkans, where she was basically getting very angry at someone because they used the word Balkan, and she felt that it was negative to say Balkan, and that no one should be allowed to use that word because it was a regressive word. And I appreciate where she's coming from. I think that, the Balkans have been characterized throughout history as a sort of, barbaric area. But I also felt very uncomfortable with her ability to determine how that word is used, and with her assertion of a right to police it in some sense. So I identify as Balkan. I mean, my father's family is from what's now Moldova, right? I'm from Romania. Where we came from before that is all over that area, right? There's no purity in my definition of self. So when I'm around friends who are, for example, from the former Republic of Yugoslavia, and some of them will still identify as Bosnian, some will identify as Serbian. Everyone identifies differently, but there's a way in which we understand when someone says, yes, it's the Balkan side. This is our life, right? We have these lines in our hands, and we don't know which side of we don't know which government, we don't know who's going to be ruling next. We don't know which war is going to divide our families or what. So I wanted to use the word, but I was also afraid that it would be held against me because I read the discourse. And so I do that a lot. I'll hear like a general claim or a statement in the discourse and suddenly go back to my poems and edit for, did I violate the discourse? And I think that that is actually a very terrible impulse in poetry on my part. I think that it is often allowing people to determine really where a poem goes and what it includes in a way that I'm not sure someone who's not from there should be able to do, you know. So I sort of I thought to myself, who am I to argue with an expert? And then I thought to myself, you know what? I'm from a minor country. Nobody speaks Romanian. It's weird. I started going down my little spiral of, you know, nothingness. And my parents who socialized us to be like, don't talk about where you're from. You know, it's a mess. And, you know, that sort of shame came up with the way that she said, you know, not to bring up Balkan. And, you know, and I think I gestured to that in some other poems where I joke about, like, here's your Dracula, you know, here's what y'all want to hear from us. Here, you can have that, right? That's the part. But when I moved to the word silenced, I also let it be sort of a personal joke with myself. I'm glad I get to share that joke because I silenced myself by removing the word, but the silencing part was a result of this weird way in which I felt I was not allowed to reference myself, right?
There was a period around 2018, towards the ends of that year, where I wanted to access more of the Slavic side of my family. And the only way I could do that was through writing these shorter persona poems about the Romanov dynasty. And ironically, the longest poem that came out of that project was in the voice of Yakov Yurovsky, who was their executioner. So that was where I had the most Slavic freedom, apparently, was in this person who snuffed out under the orders of someone else, of course, but who snuffed out the dynasty. And then once upon a time, I claimed that everything in the 20th century, you can trace it back to Alexei Romanov because his hemophilia brought in Rasputin. Rasputin brought shame to the royal family, made it easier to despise them. That led to their purging, that led to communism, that led to the arms race, the Cold War, which then led to the space race, which then we have the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it all goes back, all of 20th century history can go back to one little hemophiliac child. And I'm sure.
And, you know, look at the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I mean, look at the role that book played in what later became the Holocaust, in anti-Semitism in general, the role that it plays now in various conspiracy theories that are, you know, white supremacist conspiracy theories, and in the groups that are active, the role that it plays now in Russia too. You know, I mean, it's just, all of those things are, I think, really interesting to bring up and to think about. And I prefer to be able to speak about Romania and that space as what it was, which is a very complicated space that is not innocent. Just like living in the South, no one here is innocent, right? And it's a gift to grow up in the South because some Americans think they are innocent up north, or they're able to believe that somehow the South is you. Those of us who grow up here know this whole system and all of it, there's no innocence here. You know, and that's sort of a gift too, to move beyond the space of like trying to speak from a sort of purity and looking at, I think poetry allows us to do that in really important ways.
The prefatory material in your book, it walks us through these different connotations for door, which at one point you describe as a Romanian verb used to designate the action of hurting or aching. and a Romanian noun defined as a state of unsated longing or yearning. You tell us that as a word, it creates its own territory from fusion, which blends words rather than composing new ones. Given these contexts, could you comment on the doorness of playing possum?
I can. So the way that I wrote dor, which is a word about sort of longing, it's a Romanian word for longing. And the way that I used it in this book was by not defining it as one thing, but sort of going through and trying to define it throughout the book. And it's an attempt to do what Svetlana Boym articulated as a sort of creative nostalgia, where you're using nostalgia not to go back to a past or to resurrect a particular past or to pretend there was a golden age. In other words, it's not conservative. It creates its own space, a different space, a space that doesn't exist. So for me, that's the homeland in my head. For me, that's a land where I am in this room with my grandmother, and I've met her. I got to meet her, right? I know my namesake. It is a space in which this action that my grandfather took makes sense. It is a compossible, futurist, but also present space that is dominated by objects, but also by the numinous, by the inarticulable, and by the intersections between things, by the way a word can sometimes hold something and connote something. So I'm not sure if that's, I'm trying to think of that. It's creating a new territory from longing. So longing itself, when you think of it this way, isn't reconstructing, because we know memory itself is, I mean, come on, everybody knows that memory is rewritten every time we remember, right? The synapses give us the new story. The neuroscience on that is clear. We like to think that it was just this thing we remembered happened exactly as it did, but you know, that's complicated, and that's not really what the brain says. So, you know, taking that into account and working with that, and working with longing as a generative space that creates rather than evokes, right? Or does a mix of the two is sort of what I was aiming with this poem too.
And with memory, I've been journaling since 1999, and of course, it all started out as recording what I did as a violist and how certain practice days went. Then it branched out into more social aspects. And now I think I'm on maybe my 10th or 11th journal. But it's interesting how you said that as soon as we try to recreate the memory, we're getting a different firing of those synapses. So even what I wrote maybe on May 19th, 1999, it's not the exact memory. It's just as I remembered it in that moment. So I actually can't go back to that time. Even if I have the recording of this recital on stage, I can't orally recreate it. I mean, I'm sure I can physically recreate it going up and down the fingerboard, but perhaps emotionally, I can't tap into that exact pinpointing of it.
Right. That's right. And I think a lot of times, like, we remember our memory. So we remember and idealize the past in this process. And the mistake we make is that we think that nostalgia tells a true story about the past. And so then you get regressive nationalism. You get, you know, instead of acknowledging that it tells a story about the future or our longing, right? So the temporality of nostalgia is what and the duration is sort of what I wanted to challenge to in some of these poems, theoretically, I guess. And like you had a question about objects, right? About, I think you had asked me.
Sure, and that's actually the next question, because I am drawn to that Orthodox cross, and my favorite objects in the poem universe for the next few weeks is going to be the blue fountain pen from Czechoslovakia. Specificity, right? What might these objects say about the inner workings of playing possum based on their vantage points?
I mean, that's a great question. Um, the the icon and the decision to put it in the photo, the fact that it's there,
Mm.
is my grandfather being conventional after doing something highly unconventional. Right? It's a marker of here's the regular, here's doing what I'm supposed to do and also what she would have wished. The blue fountain pen from Czechoslovakia is one of those treasures because it was really hard to get a good pen. You had to be like highly connected or be in a place in the Communist Party where you could go to the special stores. And even then you had to have, it was just not, the elite in Romania under Ceausescu was the upper members of the Communist Party. Those were the people that had access to, all of the elite things, including vacations. It was very much a class-based society. Mm-hmm. It was just determined by membership, and that gave you access to the financial stuff. So this is this treasured pen that he didn't have ink for. He couldn't get ink for, but it was still this treasured pen that he saved because it was a fountain pen and it was from Czechoslovakia. And it was just, treated as this sort of treasure. And I've never treasured a pen before. I've never known what it means to treasure a pen, to remember where it's from, to, hold it in this high regard, almost equal to, an icon. So that was among the photos. He had a photo of his pen that was labeled, next to his wife's death, just these, I don't know. I mean, in my mind, did she sign it with that pen? Was that pen used in these important letters that they wrote to each other? How, when she worked in the village, so sometimes she, as a physician, she would go to the village and he would work in the city. And they wrote these letters to each other. Who had the pen? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I love those questions. I love speculative nonfiction. Mm-hmm. I love the idea going back to this nostalgia. I love how we can do that. So,
do you know where the pen is today?
I do not know where the pen is today. My aunt might know where the pen is today. When my grandfather died, he left a ton of papers, a ton of, he had written so much, all this research he had done, 12 cats. The house was an absolute mess. He was very introverted, but he would live in these stacks of papers with these cats just sitting on him. And I have every picture I have of him in the house. He has a cat sitting on his shoulder or in his lap or from his older days.
Interestingly enough, to this day, I do not know how to properly pick up a cat. I'm always worried that I will get the wrong bone or it will try to bite me or scratch me. I can do dogs just fine, but if you give me a cat to try and maneuver, it's not happening. But maybe that's something that I will improve at one of these decades. I've been teaching a literature class in China where American idioms have little to no carryover. And the number one thing that's made me realize is that a lot of my pedagogy, when I deliver the final takeaways in, say, a composition class, I rely on idioms, but it doesn't float across so much. The translations do not carry across. And that had me thinking about this idiom playing possum. So when I typed it in my English to Romanian translator, it gave me Jocan Possum. I'm curious if the meaning is the same idiom-wise. And my follow-up question, have you ever considered a poetic project that interrogates the idiom bridging or the lack of bridging, such as vinde gogosi, that indicates the act of lying to someone in Romanian, but its English translation is to sell donuts, or afreca nenta, which calls an idle person out. But when we hear it in English, it's to rub the mince, and that sounds more like a good luck practice.
So I love Romanian idioms, and one of as I've been working on translation, one of the biggest challenges is trying to stay true to them and give them a context where they make sense, because they're so rich. It has such rich idiomatic and hilarious language, just very like jocular, generally. Playing possum is not Jocund Possum is not a Romanian expression. It is a expression that I've heard more in the South, describing the animals along the roadside that, well, the animal's playing dead, so you won't kill it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was this I wanted to, again, bridge this space between Alabama, Romania, this imaginary world that I'm creating where the title of the poem refers to this thing that happens to this body, but it's an idiomatic expression that situates the poem in the South while the poem takes place in Romania. Mm. And I wanted to, again, bring in that sort of speculative weirdness and strangeness to make the room itself strange from the title on the door, which is Playing Possum. You mentioned the Avinde Gogosh, but fracamenta is like, okay, someone is, oh yeah, she's just rubbing the mint. That's the expression. Oh, look at it, like, or oh yeah, he's just selling donuts. Like the idea, these ideas that like these expressions, are based in vision or practices or ways of engaging the material world and the known world in Romania, things that people will do that somehow become expressions. Like, oh yeah, look, that's it. You don't have to rub mint. Mint is a weed. You don't have to like make mint grow. Mint grows there. It's sort of so a lot of them have these deep stories, and I love the thought of doing a project like that. I feel like some of the stuff that I've been working on does it inadvertently, but I haven't ever thought about like just doing, so a poem for each one, or something like that. It's a really interesting suggestion.
I mean, I'm still trying to grasp how donuts correlate to deceit. I mean,
yeah. So I mean, gogosh aren't really donuts. So it's like it's a sweet treat, right? But there's something sly about selling something sweeter than it is, I guess, is how the concept should be. Oh, they're just selling you a sweet thing, which is lying. But again, even in translation, the way these things are translated, if you wanted to translate it, it would be something more complex, like an element of dishonesty that comes with presenting something sweet, not just lying. So that's the I don't know.
Is there a Romanian idiom that has the same connotation of just playing dead to escape notice by predators? Since we go to that roadkill?
There might be. I can't think of one off the top of my head. I can't think of one off of the top of my head, and I'm sure there is one. But yeah, I don't know.
Your March 2022 essay at World Literature Today, titled 17 Reasons I Love Ellipses in Poetry, Prose, and Translation, credits Paul Celan as reason number 2 for teaching you to appreciate ellipses, to respect the sounds inside silence, to honor statements that finish in their relation to silence. The closing reason explains that silence holds an expectancy similar to that of the mystic, the state of awaiting prophecy, the desert that brings the ecstatic vision. I love the paradox of silence and how much it expects from sound. We want from the prophets, we want that answer to the question, why? But the prophet points to a larger silence to explain it. What do the ellipses in Playing Possum teach us about writing in silently prophetic modes?
Eek the prophetic mode is scary there. There's the ellipses, I think, were definitely intended to, and they come after she said, "If you love me."
Mm-hmm.
So if you love me, here the ellipses are sort of gesturing towards all of these other things in this letter and everything else we've said, which Alina and the reader can know nothing about. There's this huge thing between us, right? And she's gesturing towards it. If you love me, pointing, the ellipses are doing that. And there's a challenge in that that's being articulated. There's also a definition of love that's being articulated, and loyalty, right? Loyalty is the undercurrent of this poem and this event. Loyalty to the daughters, right? Loyalty to the husband, his loyalty to his, all of that is mixed. Loyalty to the state, where this was a crime and he was very clever and, he got away with it, probably. Who knows why he did. So I think, the prophetic mode is part of it, but it's also more the conditional mode here inflects the particular silence, and the silence here asks something too. It's part of that asking, but it's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought of it in the context of this poem. And the faceless is where the next list comes after the faceless. So, faceless is their sort of this inarticulable image or photo where she has no face. And it's so weird that we take photos of the hands without a face. It's so weird that death represents us as faceless. They're just mysteries, I guess. As Blanchot said, some traumatic mysteries too, right? They don't often get, there's nothing that's resolved in them.
I am definitely going to give ellipses more of a try now. Usually my go-to, I just need my little em dashes to just help me in a way that I think that ellipses might actually do a better job with prophecy and silence and that paradox that you speak of.
Yeah, there's expectancy in it, but there's also there's no way in which the poet tells you more there's something you can't have than with an ellipsis. That is the poet saying, and now you can't have this. It's like, it's such a powerful, like, and haunting thing. Renee Char used to, like, you see it in very haunting spaces, and also with reference to the unspeakable, the things we just cannot speak about, that would be a desecration in saying this thing, right? And that goes back to prophecy, right? And what's holy and what can be desecrated and what is sacred. And ellipses kind of, I don't know, they're just, I think they're so hard to use well, but they're also so powerful. They're so respectful in some ways.
I like that you go to respect, because where I am most comfortable with ellipses is in academic papers. And for me, there's always that formal tone, and that's where I avail myself of all things elliptical for that matter.
All ellipses, yeah.
I appreciated the contrast between your grandmother's two great hands locked in languor over her chest and Ceausescu's iron fists. How have thoughts on the female body differed from communist to post-Ceausescu Romania? And which of the two finds greater similarity to conversations about the female body currently in the United States?
I mean, that's a complicated and difficult question, because something I've been grappling with lately is how to answer those questions fairly. So going back to Bayard Rustin, one of the things that he said was, you know, after he spent some time in Africa, he said there is this idea of an undifferentiated Black community is really dehumanizing. There is no such thing. That is a construction that doesn't exist. And people in it are different. And he knew this as a queer man, right? I mean, he was very like, clearly we are different. There are people, there's difference, right? And I think of that, and in terms of Romania as well, I think of that in the diaspora, or Romanianness, the idea of Romanianness. There's no single kind of Romanian. And when people do speak about Romanianness, I often find myself thinking of the nationalists who would create a single kind of Romania and then create the sorts of borders and, you know, policing the borders of who's allowed inside that, who can define themselves as that, creating an entire politics from the definition of Romanianness, and then the sustenance of that nationalist idea, which always costs, well, people who are bearing children because they'll be responsible for having kids. And also it just costs anyone who is different. It had tremendous costs for the Roma community in Romania, and it still does. It's a racist policy, but it's also you know, an exclusive one. And so speaking about women, trying to speak about what women want, again, John, I was reading this today and I just have to quote it because it's an incredible, Aengus Press, Black Space from Black Ocean. I was reading it today, and as I was thinking about this interview, and Duplan says, "I am continually drawn to a quote from the 1988 anthology Charting the Journey, Writings by Black and Third World Women, published in the midst of the Black British feminist movement. Quote, the collection of pieces does not speak with a unitary voice, since Black women do not possess such a voice. The anthology therefore contains seemingly contradictory statements and reflects different priorities and differences of emphasis. These differences are themselves reflective of the divisions among the various constituencies of Black women." And liberation, right, when it comes to how we define feminist liberation, that doesn't include trans persons, is too limited. That's not going to work, right? Feminism also in the US has these boundaries and gates that allow you to define what it means to be feminist. So I think the emphasis on this liberationary ethics that agrees on the differentiation has been sitting in my head, looking for, I've been just thinking about it a lot lately, and it's troubling my ability to say anything concrete about this question because of the different impacts and the way people feel included or excluded from discussions about childbirth, women's bodies, etc.
Well, thank you so much for your time and illumination, Alina. I appreciate it. And especially with that last response, I love it when people bring in additional material. Could you hold that book up again, please? That is so cool.
So it's The Poetics of an Afro Future. And it's really, really, really interesting. Trans poet and curator Anaïs Duplan about the aesthetic strategies used by experimental artists of color since the 1960s to pursue liberatory possibility. It's just thought-provoking in the way that so much Afrofuturist writing is. Again, thinking of this space for me of like how we can use the speculative nonfiction and the nostalgia and focus on creating rather than, you know, reinscribing a traditional lifestyle. Can I wear a Romanian traditional shirt without people interpreting that to mean that I want to be reinscribing that lifestyle? Well, how does my embodiment and my performance of Romanianness, right, play into all of those things? I'm I'm learning or very interested in learning about about that kind of thinking.
Mhm. Excellent. Well, this was my first interview for One Week Critique, and I'm thrilled you were part of it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Your creative and critical work inspires me to have a more poetry-centered summer, regardless of how many tasks are on my daily to-do list. Who are some Romanian poets we should be reading?
Oh, there's so many, and some of them are like currently being translated. I feel like I need to write a list of these, or just put up a link. Um, if I were to say, you know, some of the older generation of poets, then I would say Nikita Stănescu is incredible and very accessible, and Sean Cotter has translated Stănescu well.
Mhm.
I would say a poet who is no longer with us and who wrote a lot, and unfortunately, a lot of it wasn't published. But Constantin Virgil Bănescu, who is often known as Bobita, he was younger. I was lucky enough to meet him when I was in Bucharest one year. Um, there are an extraordinary number of female poets that are writing in Romania, in Romanian, and I don't have a list of them, so I'm missing.
Well, this is always opening the door for, if you wanted to send me a follow-up email, I'm sure I could send it on to the social media component of One Week Critique, and we could get some of those highlighted in some posts.
I would love that. I feel like I could do more that way, because I also want to be careful, because there's so many that are
Mhm.
writing, and some have more exposure than others. And that is, you know, my goal is always, if someone has a lot of exposure, they don't really need
Mhm.
me to say anything about them. They've got that. And if someone's got a publicist, they've got that, you know, but I really want to create something level where I'm also speaking about the people that don't get as much exposure, who are doing incredibly fantastic work,
Mhm.
you know, incredibly fantastic work.
Are there any Romanian American literary societies?
There are several. I mean, and I only became aware of them really during pandemic. One of them is located in Washington, DC, and Teodor Stan runs it, or has sort of made the space for it. And I've had the opportunity to meet some incredible Romanian writers on Zoom as a result of
Mhm.
it. Um, and there is in Seattle the Romanian American Cultural Group that does the Seattle Film Festival, that has a lot of Romanian films, but also focuses on literature. Has done a great job with a reading series and a sort of discussion series about literature.
Mhm.
Otilia Baraboy was the head of it, and she's just moved on to found a French alliance there now. So she's moving through all of her multiple.
Mhm.
She did her PhD in France on Émile Cioran, and she's a brilliant writer and thinker, and I just want so much for her book to be published and for her life to be published. She's just fascinating. But she's a younger mom who is
Mhm.
starting nonprofits to, you know, pass along language and stuff. So there are organizations. There's the institute, the ICR, Instituto Român Cultural in New York, you know, and all of these groups are spaces in which I've met and learned more about other Romanian writers and what they're working on.
Is there a Franco-Romanian linkage at all?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
Like
How?
just to put it this way, like all of the Romanian artists, when they went into exile, they went to Paris.
Mm,
Everybody headed over to Paris, you know, in Romania, who learned, except in some parts of Romania. So like in Transylvania, German was more popular as a second language.
mhm.
But everybody learned French. It was sort of the language of the intellectual class, because so much of the publication work and so much of the avant-garde was in Paris. So if you looked at people like, even the Romanian surrealists, they made this decision to start writing in French also so they could be published in Paris. And some of them went to Paris. I mean, a lot of different Romanian writers went to Paris and wrote from Paris. And the relationship between Romanian writing, stylistically, Cioran ended up in Paris. And he said, I'm never writing in Romanian again. Now I'm only going to write in French. But then he also complained about that in letters to his friends saying, I'm writing in this fake language because I've given up my nationality. It's just like there's this fraught relationship between the Romanian language for Romanians in exile, but also the French language. There's a very people speak French. It's just, it's strange. My parents were like, you have to learn French when I was a kid. And I was like, why French? Nobody speaks French, Mom and Dad. They're like, oh, everybody speaks French. I'm like, no, nobody here in Alabama speaks French, And I mean, it was just this idea that, well, we speak French.
It's part of the Romanian Republic of Alabama that you write about.
It is like, it has a French, it loves French, it reads French, it the emphasis, the difference in the US sort of on the aesthetic that is like, here we we think sex is like really bad in movies, but we're like, blow up whatever you want, whereas, my parents were very much like, oh, we have to watch French movies so the kids can see what's erotic. There was no, naked people were not a big deal. That was not they were sort of shocked by the Puritanism, the sexual Puritanism of our culture in comparison to something like, the French are just a little bit more, or have been in film, I don't want to essentialize them either, so.
Well, that being said, I want to say thank you again one more time. And Door has been a meaningful read when I first got it in the mail, and then I went back and reread it in preparation for today's discussion. So thank you for your work and your support and all of your literary stewardship, and of course, your contributions to our Poetry Cafe when we get on the Zoom on those Thursday nights. I'm sure it will probably shift maybe back to Wednesday one of these days, but I've enjoyed getting to know your work and having this opportunity where we just sit down and Zoom and get to the heart of playing Possum and then work our way out into discussing the collection as a whole. This has been fascinating.
Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You're just as discursively terrible as I am. Just as likely to wander off on a tangent and chase some butterfly, and I'm grateful for it. But thank you.